Thank you so much. Many of you have come back for a second or even third time, so I'll try to present things a little bit differently so we don't... I had much the same structure from session to session, but this third one will perhaps give a little bit more time to the case, hopefully. But there's a bit of a front-end theory that I think hopefully will add something to what's happened before. Let me just begin by saying again how grateful I am to be here, but then Teppo happened to mention all these illustrious predecessors, so now I'm totally intimidated all over again. But let me try to recover from that and say thank you. I'm delighted to be here. What a wonderful honor it is to be able to present these ideas to you all and get such terrifically tonic feedback as I've received in the first two sessions, and hopefully this third one to get a chance for you to critique the ideas as I've been developing them. What I thought I'd do is, in this third session, I will be focused on the challenge of innovation, managing innovation in large, complex organizations. What I wanted to do is explain to you first, as I had done in the previous two lectures, essentially repeating what I said in the first couple of lectures about why my research is focused on large, what I've been calling high-road firms, and offer you a preview of some of the key conclusions, and then dive into the discussion of the case material and the theoretical apparatus for it. Large firms have been my focal area of interest these last years, 20, 30 years, as I've said in the previous lectures, because I don't think they're disappearing anytime soon, because they are the core of our modern economies. I'm not at all convinced by the data I've seen that average firm size or the distribution of firm size is dramatically shifting towards smaller firms. Some big firms have collapsed in the face of foreign competition. Some of them moved their operations to China, but they are still very much central to our organization, to our lives. And I want, therefore, to understand what's happening in the organization of these large enterprises. I'm particularly interested in what I call high-road firms, because it seems to me that as capitalism develops, the earlier periods focused on extensive accumulation, where firms find underutilized resources in land, labor, savings, manage to exploit those. Those opportunities dry up and firms are driven to a more intensive mode of accumulation, finding better ways, more productive ways of exploiting the resources available. Some of that is pure intensification, squeezing workers harder, squeezing suppliers to reduce their prices, but increasingly firms have to find more intelligent ways, better ways to mobilize the intelligence and creativity of both their suppliers, people, and their own staff. I suppose there was a period in which many firms leveraged the creativity of their suppliers to buy equipment that could dumb down the work that they were doing in-house. That dries up pretty quickly too, and over the development of capitalism, let's say over the last 100 years, it seems to me that the modal tendency is towards efforts to leverage creativity and intelligence of the firm's own resources. So that's what I'm interested in understanding. What is the emerging form of organization of such firms, such high-road, large enterprises? And I've laid out a series of propositions in the previous two presentations. In order not to bore the people who are here for the first couple, I've reworked them in the context of the specific challenge of innovation. They'll say much the same thing, so if you were here before, you'll recognize the general chain of logic, but hopefully this will give you a slightly different slant on it and bring everybody else who's new to the series up to speed on the general logic of the argument I want to make. Essentially, I'd like to argue that we're finding an interesting series of innovations in the management of these large, complex, high-end firms, in the way they manage key challenges. I'm going to focus tonight on innovation in particular. Innovation in these large enterprises seems to me typically to require a very interesting paradoxical mix of creativity and discipline, control and constraint, but also autonomy and independence. The standard solution in many of these larger firms is to segregate the roles, indeed the units within the organization, so some focus on the creative work, some focus on the more routine stuff. And that works pretty well, but it leaves the firm to struggle with a bunch of integration challenges. I'll explain those as we proceed. I think the Computer Sciences Corporation is one of many cases we could have given you. It's the case I'll use tonight to illustrate a more interesting, a higher performing solution to this problem. I've called it collaborative community. I'll argue point 4 that this collaborative community model requires, for its durable implementation, that the firm itself shift from a more capitalistic to a more socialistic structure in its internal operations, the internal power relations, but also in its external relations, in particular with its customers. This is an interesting problem. This is an interesting tendency, if there's any truth to it all, to my assertion at all. It's a very interesting idea for us to explore, being in the Thatcher Business Education Building. Because many of us who've studied this for a while have come away convinced that there are some pretty important arguments against the socialist model, in particular relative to innovation. In the previous two sessions, I talked about the challenges to the socialist model with respect to planning on a large scale and with respect to ensuring efficiency on a large scale. But with respect to innovation, socialism is purportedly quite a deficient system relative to capitalism. We'll talk a little bit about why. I think one of the things that's most interesting about this collaborative community principle is that it happens also to resolve the obstacle to socialism in dealing with this innovation challenge, and thereby posing to us a very interesting prototype for something I've been calling high-performance socialism as an alternative model. The latter set of propositions, 5, 6, and 7, try to draw some implications from this. If it's indeed the case that that organizations find this collaborative community principle a higher performing principle, and if it's indeed the case that it requires on their part a shift to a more socialistic structure of property and control relations within and between firms, then we have an interesting problem. Proposition 6 argues simply that low-road competition will undermine the capacity of this high-performance socialism system, that will undermine its viability within the firms that adopt it and undermine the likelihood of its diffusion across the rest of the industrial context. We might imagine a regulated form of capitalism blocking the low road. My argument will be in the form of a simple assertion. History has demonstrated that regulated capitalism is not durable. Therefore, the alternative to me seems logically to be a more systematic socialist transformation of the economy, posing one last dilemma for us, which is, well, where would the forces for such a socialist transformation come from? Everybody seems to be quite alert to the demise of many of the traditional forces that might spur such a socialist transformation, disappearance of unions, left-wing movements, and so forth. And I'm going to argue that at least one countervailing consideration is the experience of workers in these high-performing systems, these high-performing socialist systems, that seems to add to their capacity to act as agents of socialist transformation. So that, in broad outline, is a series of ideas I wanted to present to you today. Let's dive into the specifics of the particular challenge we're talking about. Innovation in organizations, large, complex organizations, has to contend with the fact that in such large organizations, innovation requires that the organization undertake two parallel sets of challenges, or confront two parallel sets of challenges. The challenge of what we call exploitation, using Jim March's terminology. We can think of organizations needing to find ways to exploit existing knowledge, existing capabilities, existing know-how. Exploitation here not in the Marxist or critical sense, but in the everyday sense of simply using resources more efficiently. And exploration, developing new competencies, exploring new spaces, developing new capabilities. These tasks require, in the traditional teaching of organization design, two very different types of organizations. A more mechanistic bureaucracy here, a more organic and flexible or ad hocracy over here. Why is combining them difficult? Well, we'll get to that in 1 second, but the implication is that the options for organization design run along the spectrum, along the diagonal here, and that if you're below that production possibilities frontier, as it were, you're going to be ineffectual. But being above it is impossible. Impossible, why? Because mixing these two forms of organization, the organic and the mechanistic, is like mixing oil and water. These are very different organizing principles. And if you try to mix them in the same organization, you have a serious problem. In reality, of course, many organizations are trying to solve this problem, and there are quite a few ways that they've found around this challenge. The name for this challenge I mentioned in the very first lecture in the contemporary literature is ambidexterity, how to do these two things at once in the same organization. One way to do it is by alternating between the exploration tasks and the exploration tasks, between a mechanistic organization for a certain period of time and then switch to a more organic ad hocracy organization in another period. We saw this at NUMI yesterday. NUMI runs a regular assembly line for 4 years, and then every 4 years has to rip up the assembly line, reconfigure it for a major model change, and it moves into a much more organic mode for a period of several months, right, before reverting to exploitation mode. The functional form of ambidexterity is an even more familiar one to us. Many organizations have an R&D organization, an R&D unit, coming up with great new concepts, organized on a very organic basis. They hand over those projects to the operations department to implement that, to exploit that new concept. The structural form is a concept that some of our colleagues have been working on recently, where you might have, within the same business unit, you might have two different businesses fully equipped with a whole range of functions, R&D as well as operations and marketing, running on a more exploitation path or a more exploration path. And the senior management team will somehow arbitrate between them and work out what products might flow from one unit to the other within that. The network model is an interesting one. Some organizations might themselves focus on exploiting capabilities, but might outsource the innovation activities. Or they might have a set of suppliers, some of whom deliver them superb exploitation capabilities, others with whom they contract for their exploration capabilities, and the organization itself somehow marry them all. And then finally, there's another form that some of us have been interested in recently, where somehow people magically find within the same people, within the same teams, the capacity to do both at once. Seems a little mysterious, but actually the NUMI case is not a bad example of it. Workers on the assembly line in the course of the working day come up with ideas. As they're working, as they're doing the routine exploitation stuff, they come up with new ideas about what they might do differently, better in the future. All of these are possible, but all of them pose important challenges to an organization wanting to somehow weave these together. Bridging these two kinds of activities is difficult. I talked before about the basic difficulty of combining the oil and water of mechanistic and organic, just to give you the flavor of one set of these. Take this functional form of ambidexterity we talked about a second ago. The R&D unit coming up with a new concept, and the operations unit working out how to mass produce it and deliver it. I'm sure many of you have studied such organizations or worked in such organizations. The manufacturing unit is typically not very happy to have its operation disrupted by this radical new concept that's foisted on them, that now they have to find a way to deliver. They've been looking very good in making their numbers every month, keeping their budgets keeping their numbers within budget, delivering product on time. Now they have to rip everything up and adapt themselves to this radical new concept that their R&D people have foisted on them. Not such an easy conversation. There are many mechanisms that organizations use to smooth the relations between the players involved in this exploitation task and exploration task. I'm going to cut to the chase and say that the critical issue, as I'm going to focus on it, is a relationship of trust and a bond of community between the people working on the more exploration aspects, tasks, and the people on the more exploitation aspects and tasks. The reason I think that trust and community are so critical is almost by elimination. If you stop and think about it, or if you take out a pencil and paper and try to solve this problem for yourself, you'll see pretty quickly there is no way you can write a set of work procedures, a job description, design a set of financial incentives that simultaneously incentivizes people or instructs people how to accommodate themselves to these two very different types of tasks. They are essentially incommensurable. Is that overstating the point? I don't think so. There's some very interesting work in organizational economics that suggests there are ways to write incentive contracts that might, for an individual, incentivize them to both be very efficient in exploitation and to come up with new ideas. But as soon as you try to generalize that to groups of people, you realize that you've got all sorts of agency problems, all kinds of shirking problems. You simply can't control this bureaucratically or through financial incentives. The only way the typical way in which we resolve the tension between R&D and operations in an organization, insofar as the organization has managed to resolve it, insofar as they've managed to push out this frontier towards its ambidexterity, high cell, is through relations of strong trust, a bond of community, a sense that we're all working to the same purpose. And that if our manufacturing unit has to accommodate itself to this radical new product innovation, that's for the good of everybody. Let's put our minds to it, and that way we're not sitting there resentful and fending off the incursions of these R&D people. So then the question is, what kind of trust, what kind of bond, what kind of community is it that we want between these exploration-oriented folks and the exploitation-oriented folks that could resolve this problem for us? If it's not financial incentives that align our incentives, if it's not bureaucratic procedures that tell us how to manage these two sorts of tasks at the same time and somehow balance them in the optimal manner. And I introduced to you in our first session, a little typology by Max Weber that I have found useful in thinking about these problems. And today I wanted to return to it and flesh out some other aspects of it. You might recall in the first session, I explained that Weber identified 4 forms of social action. They can be arrayed across this 2x2. Action that is either traditionalistic in the sense of being either just a matter of pure habit or based on reverence for established patterns. Action that's oriented through our affective relations with the other person. Actions that are instrumentally rational, where we take for granted what the goal is, and now we're just focused on finding the optimal path to achieve that given goal. An action that's more value rational, where we have in mind some higher purpose, some higher goal, and we've constantly got that goal in mind in order to decide what the appropriate course of conduct might be. I gave the example on Tuesday of integrity as a higher order goal. Very hard to think through how to behave with integrity in some generic fashion. You've got to look at the situation. You've got to think about what behavior might be appropriate to that ultimate value. That's value rational organization, value rational goal. Each of these types of social action can become the modal type for a different type of organization. A clannish type traditional structure, a charismatic organization that relies on the effective connection between followers and members, followers and leaders. A bureaucracy and market are 2 variants of instrumentally rational action. And then this collegial model we talked about on Tuesday being an exemplar of the value rational based interaction. What kind of bond, this is a test, what kind of bond, what kind of trust do we need to support ambidextrous behavior in organizations? An ambidextrous collaborative link between the R&D function and the operations function, between a supplier that might be offering some innovative concept for us and an organization that's tried to procure that and now needs to implement it in its operations, or between the 2 business units, between the doctors at Kaiser Permanente and the administrative support staff in the back office that's just trying to keep everything routine. I'll give you a little breakdown. Seems to me pretty clear that traditionalistic forms of social interaction are not going to do the job. That's neither effective at driving innovation, nor is it much of a grounding for developing innovative, radical new concepts. The charismatic form of organization is well known for being quite effective at developing breakthrough concepts. You might think of Apple under Steve Jobs as a charismatic organization driven by people's affective connection to Steve Jobs and his vision for what the product might look like. Terrific at exploration, terrible at exploitation. That's why we pay so much for this Apple product. Markets are pretty good too at exploration. They give a lot of flexibility. If you think about the market as a multiplicity of organizations, each exploring different options, right? But in aggregate, it's a pretty inefficient process. There's a lot of wasted effort as markets proceed in their discovery process. Bureaucracies, conversely, very good at exploitation. We know what we're doing. We write a procedure for it. We implement that. We can be even very aggressive, like NUMI, at continually improving the efficiency with which we exploit our existing know-how. Not great at exploration. That's not the way you'd organize an R&D organization. This value rational form seems like a pretty cool way to bring people together so that those working, or those moments in which we're more engaged in exploratory development can be linked productively to our sense that we also need to be able to exploit this knowledge very compelling. So, value rationality. I've spent some time thinking about what kind of bond, what kind of community this value rationality might be. And where I wanted to take you tonight, it does take us another dead German. I'm sorry about that. We've talked about Max Weber. So the other guy that comes to my mind when I look at this chart is a buddy of his, Ferdinand Tönnies, who developed a typology of which that Weber was somewhat critical of for the reasons that may be obvious looking at this slide, as being a bit underdeveloped. But it's a typology that is very much present in, I think, our everyday understanding of the world. There is this thing we call community, for which the prototype is the clan, the family, the tribe. It's some mix of traditionalistic and affective connection. And there's something else, this world, the modern world of bureaucracy and markets. This is not community. This is almost the antithesis of community. Usually Turney's term for this, Gesellschaft, is usually translated as society, and yes, it's a term that means society. A better word for it in this context, or even literally, might be association. An instrumental association of individuals who come together for the instrumental purpose of advancing their material self-interest. Community and association. Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft are the German terms. These are enduring prototypes, enduring paradigms that shape our thinking, that have shaped the thinking of sociologists for 150 years as they've sought to understand modernity, but I think shape our understanding every day of, when you use the word community, I think it evokes the terms on the left-hand side of this chart, some mix of habit, reverence for established patterns, effective connection, and this world of instrumental rationality that is virtually the antithesis of community. I only trust you insofar as it's in my self-interest to do so. My argument is that we are seeing the emergence of a new type of community in this bottom right corner. This is a distinctive type of community, and that's the form of community I wanted to explore with you tonight. It's a different take on the story we developed on the first night, on Tuesday. And my argument is that we could call this, for want of a better word, collaborative community. And I'm not going to walk through all of these dimensions for you, but just simply to say that if you just scan them, it seems like what's at stake here is something of a synthesis. I said I was only going to talk about two dead Germans. Let's invoke a third, Hegel. It's some sort of dialectical synthesis of elements of the community, Gemeinschaft world, and elements of the Gesellschaft world. That there's something empowering about the individualism, the universalism, the features of that instrumental association have certainly contributed a lot to the affluence of the modern era. And it turns out if you want to drive this ambidexterity forward, some synthesis between these two forms of community, or forms of collectivity, if you will, seems appropriate. And it's some, I would say, new higher form of community that emerges in this context. Higher than the traditionalistic, effectual type of community with which we're familiar. So what I wanted to do today was take you into one little case of a workplace in which I think these issues have been played out in an interesting fashion, and we get a feeling for what this collaborative community might look like. The world of software development, I gave you photos of automobile plants and stuff like that. You saw some hospital settings, so I figured I had to find some moving image of what software development looks like. But I'm interested, I said, in large-scale software development work. Software is renowned for its screw-ups. The company I'm going to talk about tonight, Computer Sciences Corporation, was royally screwing up the National Health Systems IT system just a few years ago. Large, complex software systems are what I'm interested in. This seems to me much more interesting than the world of little apps that 3 or 4 people develop over the weekend in their back room. I'm interested in industrial strength software and the combination of the challenge of efficiency and control and creativity in this setting. It has not worked very well. This is a world of major catastrophe time after time. There's something about software, it's a bitch. I think that's the technical term. It's really hard to get these large systems right. The clients are continually changing the specifications on you. That's an enormous headache. But just the detail, the complexity, the rigor with, the fact that you get a comma out of place blows up the whole 10 million lines of code. It's a very interesting world. In response to the challenges of ensuring some degree of reliability in software development, there's been a whole panoply of managerial technologies developed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Some of them are focused on technological solutions, some of them are focused more on techniques, and some of them have focused on the management side. I'm going to focus on this last one, it's a TQM-inspired approach to try to bring more discipline to the process of software development without squeezing out the creativity and hopefully augmenting the capacity of the organization to be creative. The tool that I'm interested in here, or the process I'm interested in here, is called the Capability Maturity Model. Since my study took place, it's been superseded by the CMMI, Capability Maturity Model Integrated, but it's the same basic concept. In Europe, you've had similar initiatives. I think early on it was called SPICE, and then the ISO people took a hold of it. It's quite a common model in large-scale, complex, industrial-strength systems design world. And It was originally developed under the impetus of the Department of Defense, frustrated by the repeated failure of these large-scale software systems development, and eventually has developed a whole family of systems that essentially give you a model for what the software development process should look like, and enable you to calibrate the level of sophistication, the level of control, and the level of continuous improvement capability that your software process embodies. The levels that they've identified, this follows, some of you may be familiar with Crosby's quality is free, follows the same basic idea. The initial level, they call it initial, but I think initially they called it ad hoc or stupid or something, I forget what it was called. They've cleaned it up a little bit, but it relies on competent people and heroics. This is what most software looks like. It does not work very well when you scale it up, when you've got hundreds or thousands of people working on a software process. By the time you get to level 5, you're talking about really a software factory process that is remarkably free from schedule problems or quality problems, and, interestingly, capable of delivering very innovative software as well. The company I'm going to talk about, Computer Sciences Corporation, has had its share of screw-ups. I mentioned one, famous one, at the National Health System here in the UK. They've had all sorts of problems with fraud and other kind of problems. But I happened to get a chance to study a few of their units in the federal sector, developing software systems for big federal agencies. The one I'll talk about, I happened to do a lot of work for NASA. For the sake of some degree of discretion, I called it Program A. They had a long-standing relationship with their client. This was a pretty big, complex organization. They had about 1,500 people when I was studying them, or just before. They produced mid-sized projects of considerable complexity, a mix of maintenance work and radical innovation work, new languages, new functionality their customer was demanding, and very rapidly embraced this capability maturity model, and over a period of years went from the ad hoc heroics and great people to the factory model of software development. The transition was painful. So this is in the words of a young software engineer I spoke to who had just joined recently. The Program 4 was a level 5 organization. I studied 3 other groups that were at level 3, so they said. I said one other, just almost at level 5. So 2 at level 5 and 2 at level 2 or 3. So this was a young fellow who just moved into the level 5 organization, and described in this way that his experience coming from a world of level 1 into a world of level 5. I can write code in 2 hours, but then I have to spend 2 days documenting it. It can be very frustrating. We have to document check-in, check-out, detailed design plan, development plan. I have to print out all the differences between the old and the new code. There's documentation for inspection and certification, internal software delivery form, a test plan. All these need to be signed. I used to be an independent developer for about 4 years before I came here. I never even created a flowchart for my work. The only documentation I needed was a to-do list. I had to change a lot of habits when I got here, you bet. Program A, we saw dramatic improvement in the level of productivity, the number of lines of code per programmer, and dramatic decline in the level of in the defects per average line of code. I could have added another chart here, nice chart that they developed on the level of schedule predictive accuracy. So they were almost never late any longer, delivering this really superb quality code that they were able to develop as they moved from level 2 to level 5 on this CMM model. So what I wanted to do was very briefly give you a feeling for the fabric of community within this program, or the level 5 organizations that I had a chance to study here, and give you a sense of what it felt like, what was this form of community, the bond that enabled them to work together, to maintain such incredible control and efficiency, productivity, and control over their schedule and cost, and very dramatic functional innovation, very dramatic, progressive incorporation of radically new languages and so forth. So I'm just going to quickly go through 4 aspects of the organization to give you a sense of the synthesis that I think characterizes this collaborative community model. At the level of values, this is interesting, isn't it? That jiggles a little bit, doesn't it? Doesn't that drive you mad? Is that because I'm walking around too much? Is there anything you can do? No, I don't think there's anything you can do. Okay. A more mature process means you go from freedom to do things your own way to being critiqued. It means going from chaos to structure. It's a bit like street ball playing basketball out on the street with your friends, versus NBA basketball. Street ball's roughhousing, showing off. You play for yourself rather than the team. You do it for the love of the game. In professional basketball, you're part of a team. You practice a lot together, doing drills, playing practice games. You aren't doing it just for yourself or even just for your team. There's other people involved. You have to take responsibility for other people, your teammate, for mentoring other players. Very interesting shift from a much more individualistic mindset to something much more interesting, much sort of more, I'll call it interdependent. I'll come back to that a little later on. I've got several more quotes of this kind, and I found them really thought-provoking, and I hope I can get you to feel the same curiosity as I did for the changing psychology of these people. These are software developers who come with an enormous occupational culture that privileges autonomy, that privileges the fact that I never had to have anything more than a to-do list in order to orchestrate my own work. And now they're embedded in this factory concept in which there are simultaneously to be super disciplined and really creative. So I think this is, for me, this is very intriguing. I hope I can share that enthusiasm with you. In terms of the norms, I think there's a fascinating mix here of universalistic attention to generic rules and particularistic attention to the specific context of the project. That happens in two ways. Firstly, we have a set of universal rules for how software development should work, but then they get tailored for the specific project. People have to be a part of defining the process. We always say that people support what they help create. That's why the tailoring cycle is so important. As a project manager, you're too far away from the technical work to define the standards and procedures, S&P, standard procedures yourself, so you have to involve your key people. It's only by involving them you can be confident you have good S&Ps that have credibility in the eyes of their peers. So we've got a generic set of procedures, but now we've got a specific project. We know that the specific project, creative project that we're engaged in, isn't some generic project. It's not just another car rolling down the assembly line. We need to tailor the standardized worksheets that we saw last night to the specific task of this individual project, and we mobilize everybody who's working on that project to do that together. Interestingly, that doesn't mean that we find no more value in the standardized process. One of my other interviewees said, you'll discover that even the very innovative projects, most of the tasks are ones you've done many times before. Then, for the tasks that are truly novel, you can still leverage your prior experience by identifying somewhat related tasks and defining appropriate guidelines based on those similarities. They won't be precise instructions of the kind you'll have for the truly repetitive work, but those guidelines can be a very useful way to bring your experience to bear on the creative part. Last night, somebody asked me, don't routines and formalized procedures rigidify operations and force us into a repetitive mode? I think there's a nice example of the way in which routines can be enacted in a much more flexible manner that supports innovation. Third, I said levels of, the fabric of authority seems to somehow synthesize very more communalistic, if you will, and more instrumental associational modes. But there were two ways in which I saw that happening. Firstly, there was a lot of participation by staff in defining the generic procedures. So we have software engineering process groups in each of these 4 units that I study, where staff involved in each of these units mobilize to define the standard procedures that are then going to be tailored for the individual projects. And then secondly, in the fabric of authority in the organization, very interesting power wielded by these software developers. This was a manager describing to me the way they've experienced this. By and large, we haven't had too much difficulty bringing our managers around to this more collaborative approach. We choose our project managers with an eye to their commitment to collaboration too. We did have a problem with one staff person, and not only one, there were quite a few. He had a very difficult relationship with the project people he was supposed to be helping. We got a lot of complaints that he was trying to force the projects to conform to his idea of how they should function. We tried to counsel him and get him to work in a more cooperative way, just wouldn't ease up. Had to, as we say in America, let him go. What do you say in the United Kingdom? I think fire him would be the sack. There we go, I had to sack him. And it's quite a very interesting discipline that management had to maintain over the kind of behavioral interaction modes. And then finally, some mix of specialist and generalist skills. We need deep specialization to capture this deep expertise, but we need people who can understand enough about the other people doing other specialized tasks, and I think finding a way to synthesize the specialization needed with the generalist skills needed so that everybody can contribute to that ambidextrous challenge, that's an interesting one. And here we see it being played out, at least in the way the work is organized. process means that people play more specialized defined roles, but also that these specialists get involved earlier and longer as contributors to other people's tasks. If we analyze the way a coder uses their time and compared it with comparable data, say 15 years ago, we'd find the coders doing less coding because of more automated tools, spending more time documenting their code. We read about that earlier on, both as it was being built and afterwards in user's guide, but also spending more time in peer reviews, more time in design meetings, more time in so deep specialization, but also deep, broader engagement with a variety of other specialists. So very emerging in that context, an interesting combination of what I call T-shaped skills, right? So we got our own little specialization, but we're building enough knowledge of the related activities so that we can be effective collaborators in that task, in that collaborative process. Point one, ambidexterity requires a more collaborative community. I've given you 4 ideas to anchor that concept of collaborative community as a real form of community, but one very distinct from the Gemeinschaft type community. There is a German word for this, in case you're interested, that seems to fit pretty well. We might contrast Gemeinschaft, community, Gesellschaft, association, and Genossenschaft. Genosse is kind of comrade. Genossenschaft is kind of cooperative. It's a word used in German, I'm told, to refer to cooperative type structures. Genossenschaft seems like, if you wanted to go the German route, seems like not a bad way to keep with the G's. So that's point one. The other point I wanted to try to make, you might recall from that outline of my argument I proposed at the beginning, was that in order to maintain this collaborative community, we're going to need to see a shift in the organization towards a more socialist rather than capitalist model of the enterprise. Evidence for that in this case is modest, but allow me to provoke you with these elements of evidence. Workers need power in such an organization in order for them to have confidence that this trust, that the trust they invest in management will be reciprocated. Workers have power. They had the power to fire autocratic managers. They have power to participate and indeed veto some of the processes. Management in this organization tried to implement a programming language some of you may know from many years ago called Ada. Ada was a big favorite of the sort of managerial elite within the software universe about 20 years ago. The programmers hated it, and they vetoed it. They said, no, we're not doing it, and management had to back off. They participate in defining project-level procedures. I think it's fair to say in a setting like this, perhaps aided enormously, you might say, by the human capital of these software engineers that gives them a lot of mobility. If they don't like it, they can walk. Management is not eager to lose their staff. They have some real power. The strategic commitment of the firm to delivering high quality to its customers is an important part of maintaining this collaborative community. I'll give you a few quotes about that in a second. And then cooperation with the customer turns out to be crucial. You cannot have a level 5 organization in the CMM framework if your partner is not willing to work with you to work on a continuously planning and replanning basis to ensure that your product is meeting their requirements. So, to the second part of the story then, I do think it seems to me that we've got here a very interesting example where collaborative community solves one of the basic problems that Margaret Thatcher and her spiritual advisors like Hayek would have pointed out to us regarding the socialist model. The socialist model is traditionally seen as not very effective at galvanizing innovation because if you begin with the assumption that the more routine and more creative jobs would need to be somewhat specialized in the organization, right, that seems like not something a socialist organization would be willing to do. And here we see with this collaborative community concept that we're able to both fuse those jobs but also enable collaborative relations between specialized tasks if we go at it in this collaborative community fashion. Creativity requires individualism. Socialism seems to require, I think there's a lot of things about socialism that require much more collectivistic values. And here we find some synthesis of individualism and collectivism that seems to at least arguably surmount that challenge. And then efficiency requires standardization. We discussed this at length yesterday. Here we see forms of standardization that instead of being resisted as alienating, as the one imagines might be normally the case in a socialist, cooperatively organized enterprise, we see workers here embracing that standardization as a vehicle for achieving goals that they care about too. I want to argue that the generalization, the diffusion of this model is not easy because low-road competitors can make it infeasible for the firm that tries to take the high road. Low road competitors can sometimes offer cheaper products and grow faster and therefore attract more investors and put the high road organization out of business. This model may be very effective if it's given a chance, but in competition with low road competitors, it may not survive. Its generalization, I would like to argue, requires a much more systematic blocking of the low road, and then we move to a higher equilibrium point where many organizations can adopt this collaborative community as a norm in the way they operate internally, and we would all get the benefits. But that requires a much more radical transformation at a societal level, that these little islands of socialism are not going to survive in the capitalist market. There's a long literature about why the prospects for such a societal transformation are ever dimmer in the long 20th century. Well, short 20th century, something like that. In the course of the 20th century, the forces for that socialist transformation seem to have diminished rather than strengthened. I think of this as a countervailing consideration. Let me explain why briefly and hopefully open it up for some conversation. Capitalism under the capitalist model, the prevalence of the capitalist model, in the form especially of low-road competitors in the software development arena, handicaps the viability of this collaborative model and indeed impairs the performance of the organization. One of the managers there says to me, it's hard to convince people that improving the process will help us get or keep business. We had a world-class process, and look what happened to us. This is program A, reached level 5, did this superb software, budget cuts. Sorry, they went from 1,500 people to, I think it was 500 people. Morale collapsed, right? Input to all these wonderful tailoring processes dissipated, right? They were really left high and dry as a result of vagaries of the market. Jobs in an organization like this depend a lot more on the vagaries of contracting than on our process excellence. Another one of my interviewees said there, a key challenge in pursuing process improvement here is maintaining buy-in at the top. Our top corporate management's under constant pressure from the stock market. The market's looking constantly at margins, but government business has slim margins. That doesn't leave much room for expenditures associated with process improvement, especially when they take 2 or 3 years to pay off. This is from a middle-level, sort of higher-level technical guy. I talked about the fact that you can't have this very high level of process maturity unless your customer is a partner with you in that process. The biggest problem here is, this is the program B. They were doing some work for the State Department. The biggest problem here has been the customer and getting their buy-in. Some of their managers even told us they just simply didn't want to hear about quality assurance, about our quality management system. They saw it as wasteful overhead. When you bid a project, you have to specify a project for quality assurance and so forth. But if they don't want to pay, you've got a resource problem. You can't deliver the quality that your system's capable of delivering. So capitalism, I think, undermines the viability of this model, notwithstanding its superior potentiality. I do think, though, that the experience of workers here makes them more conscious of these issues, shifts their mentality, and arguably, as I said a minute ago, adds some hopefulness to the prospect of a transformation in which workers might take the lead because they're no longer simply defending their autonomy, but now engaged by the challenge of thinking about how to improve the value that their organization is creating. Joan Greenbaum wrote a wonderful book about the life of software developers back in the 1970s, and she describes, several of her interviewees described the ethos of software developers. As I said, in highly individualistic occupational culture, their experience of the effort to bring management discipline to the software development arena took the form of a guild-like defensiveness. What kind of job security would we have if we wrote everything down the way they wanted us to? We didn't like it when things got too out of control. But on the other hand, would you see to it, or would you see to it that your job was so standardized that it could be done by a monkey? This was the corporatist, guild-like defensiveness in the face of efforts to bring more discipline to the software process back in the 70s. And instead, now I hear employees talking in language like this. We could do better at capturing and using lessons learned with all the vehicles for doing it now, presentations, newsletters, databases, but it takes time. There's so many competing priorities. In the end, it's all about profits and meeting schedules. This is a very different critique of your employer's practices than the one that we saw in the 1970s. This is a critique saying, we want to deliver value. This capital system is screwing us, is stopping us from delivering the value we want to deliver. Let me finish with one last thought, and then I want to quickly survey some of the concerns that people have raised over the past couple of nights, anticipate some that you may feel tonight, and quickly nail down a few of those elements so we can engage the conversation. My last point about the prospects of a socialism, I've put here a little bit provocatively. Many people have observed that socialism seems to require a new kind of psychology. The new socialist man was the term that was sometimes used in the Russian literature, the Soviet literature. And I think, interestingly, we see something of that emerging in this context. And I talked before about self-construals. There's a very interesting literature in cultural psychology about varieties of self-construal. The sense of who am I? Who has agency here? Is it me or us? What does that mean? In the traditional community, this term is not used, dependent self-construal. The literature here is typically contrasted independent self-construals, Western, Gesellschaft worlds, and interdependent self-construals. I think this misses a very important distinction. In the traditional Gemeinschaft world, our self-construal was highly dependent. Our sense of who we were is very much a function of what role we played in the society, what status was imparted to us. It was an ascribed status, not an achieved status. In the Gesellschaft world, of modern achievement-oriented world, right? This is me, and these are all the people around me, and I have some connection with them, right? But it's an associational connection. I think what we see being played out at CSC, if you'll forgive me extrapolating from this few little quotes, is a genuinely interdependent sense of self where I am simultaneously collectivistically oriented and individualistically oriented. I've got me, I've got us, and somehow, situationally, I'm going to juggle those two values, those two priorities, those two meaningful senses of agency in my world. There endeth the lesson. So let me quickly move to some critiques that have been advanced and see if I can help you clarify what I think is the import of what I'm saying and sort out the others. Are these models simply enlightened capitalism? Why am I calling them socialist in any way? Many of them, obviously, are being implemented by people who are simply smart, intelligent, thoughtful, caring capitalists, managers. But I don't think they can be robust without this broader socialist transformation. Therefore, my argument is, they are objectively socialist, even if the agents currently propagating them may be not at all interested in a socialist outcome. The market for virtue, tells us our colleague David Vogel at Berkeley, is simply too thin to imagine that people might gravitate towards these higher performing organizations and their products in order to do the right thing, buy the products from the right people. There's just not enough of that energy in a market economy to ensure the propagation of these new practices. Regulated capitalism, I'll assert, you can challenge me by all means, is simply too feeble. It's proven its course over the last 100 years as waxing and waning. Many of you in the room may be familiar with the arguments of Carl Polanyi, his brother, who argued that the market economy disembedded, the coming of the market disembedded the economy from society, from culture, from the state, right? And that provokes a counter-movement towards the re-embedding of the economy under normative constraints and regulatory constraints. Reread Polanyi one day. Do me a favor, because what he then goes on to argue is that such re-embedding moves always inevitably provoke a disembedding move. The interests that are being harmed by this re-embedding do not give up so easily. And that's why Polanyi was not a social democrat. He was a socialist. He was saying there's a double movement, moving back and forth between disembedding and re-embedding, disembedding and re-embedding. The only way out of this infernal cycle is to a qualitative transformation of society towards a more rigorously socialist form. Can I generalize beyond these firms? Yes. Clearly, I'm painting a very positive picture, one-sided picture about these firms. But my point is not that we can extrapolate directly from the experience of these firms, but rather that workers' experience in these firms makes the idea of socialism seem viable and attractive, makes the idea of the prototypical capitalist manner of organization within and between firms seem increasingly obsolete and illegitimate, and equips these workers with the kind of personal skills, cognitive horizons that make them the kinds of people likely to join a genuine socialist transformation process. My argument is not that they're about to join a revolutionary movement. That depends on political circumstances. My argument is simply that they are increasingly, through their experience in the process of capitalist development, they're increasingly developing the capabilities that make them more competent subjects, more competent agents of such a transformation. Let me just quickly jump to the last one. Socialism, what do I mean by socialism? as I said, I want to abstract from the experience of the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries to focus on the core concept, replacing market competition by cooperation, replacing wage relationships where I exchange my freedom to, and obey your authority as a manager in exchange for a wage. I don't think we know very much about what this socialist system would look like, but we've got some ideas and we can work it out as we go along if you give us a chance. Somebody asked me the other day, a couple of people have asked me, does this have to be a global transformation? If these low-road competitors are all over the globe, could we do something in Europe or in Cambridge or Oxford or Los Angeles or New York? And the answer is yes, you can certainly get things going. You can certainly give people some reason to think that an alternative is possible. And I think these efforts to create cooperatives, fabrics of cooperatives, networks of cooperatives, whether it's Mondragon or the people that are doing it in Cleveland or all over the place, we have sprouts of these new alternative forms of organization emerging. They give people confidence that an alternative is possible. I don't think we can anticipate them just gradually proliferating and displacing the capitalist system. The corrosive power of low-road competitors domestically and internationally make that seem, to me, a very implausible prospect. And in the meantime, the connections between working people across the world are growing too. So I think the chances are good, looking long-term into the future. So with that, maybe I should stop and give some people a chance to ask more questions. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
So we can take a few questions. Heli, one of our brilliant DPhil students, has a microphone there. So do we have any questions? Oh, sure. Start there.
That's fine. Thank you.
It's good for the cameras if you use it.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Geert Sirako, Warwick Business School. I think it's very commendable that you are actually drawing on these classical theorists, as was mentioned in the introduction, because I'm sure that most people in the room will agree that a lot of the research that gets published today tends to be quite shallow theoretically. And these people indeed provided quite a thorough and in-depth understanding of the normative implications of the actions that underpin bureaucratic work, bureaucratization, rationalization process, etc. So from that perspective, I think it's very commendable. I disagree with you on certain points. Again, as someone who has read these works, the original works of Ferdinand Tönnies and Max Weber, first of all, when you start, you progress based on the assumptions that the organic and mechanistic forms are distinct, that the enabling and coercive forms are distinct. This is, of course, one of the fundamental assumptions both of Tönnies and Weber, was that the bureaucratization rationalization process was guided by the values of calculative rationality, or instrumental rationality, or means-end rationality, whatever. Yeah? And that this form of action entailed both concern with creativity, freedom, and adaptation to change, what would be considered enabling aspects simultaneously. So any form of the application of calculative rationality, according to them, entailed both concerned with adaptation to change, yeah, and concern with maintenance of existing structures, functional integration, etc. You know, and these insights have been, when you suggest that it has been generally taken for granted, you know, they were highlighted by Blau, the whole concept, differentiation theory, or differentiation of organizations means differentiation in terms of functional differentiation, in terms of giving freedom and autonomy to people to exercise their functions, again, based on calculative rationality, you know, Parsons, Crozier, etc., etc. So I think from that perspective, you start by differentiating these two forms, and then you are integrating them based on value rationality. It's quite an exciting solution. But again, wouldn't you say that the interdependent structure of work itself is embedded in the principles of calculative rationality, where people are instrumentally using each other as means to an end? And this was one of the concerns of Max Weber, that in socialist systems, bureaucratization, dealing with large scale, will not leave much space for autonomy, etc. So how will, in these collaborative communities that are based on principles of interdependence, by the way, which also underpin Gemeinschaft, when you say that it's independent, of course, the Gesellschaft is also interdependent, no doubt. Yeah, so we may be moving even to a higher state of interdependence in a way. Yeah.
Maybe we'll let Paul respond
for a while.
This sounds perfect for the drinks reception, which is right afterwards. But maybe we'll let Paul respond, and then we've got a couple more questions. And so, yeah.
So clearly, systems like bureaucracy facilitate enormous, large-scale, complex interdependence. What it doesn't do in that process is free up the creativity and intelligence of the people assigned to these specific offices, as we think of them in the classic bureaucracy, to work together to come up with new solutions. It is, their procedures are driven from above by staff specialists. There is not a lot of bottom-up collaboration and innovation in such a system. The bureaucracy is a wonderful instrument, says Weber, for implementing the will of the master, not for mobilizing the creativity of the masses. For that, we need something else. And if we're to do it in a way that simultaneously preserves the efficiency and control by bureaucracy, now we need some new synthesis, and that's what I'm trying to articulate.
Just to add, that for Weber, the bureaucratization process entailed removal of traditional constraints.
Yes, we're okay.
Of increasing autonomy, creativity, etc.
Correct. No, we're on the same.
Okay, so I think there was one right here, and then another one over here, so we'll take in that order.
Wonderful presentation, Paul. I'm Annabelle Gower from Imperial College. I have a question, which is very short. Could you help me understand what you mean by performance in this context? You talked about high-performance organization in the socialist context. I think I pretty well understand what performance means for organizations in a capitalist system. What do you mean here by performance?
I'm using a very common sense understanding of the term. For this model to represent high performance, socialist or otherwise, would be capable of delivering high quality products at low cost, responding with creativity and efficiency and control. So I'm mushing together all the dimensions of performance that we typically care about.
I think we have another question right here.
But you've probably got some thought in mind in asking this question.
I have some thought in mind, yes.
So why don't we tease you out on this?
I don't want to take up too much time. I think the way we tend to think about performance for organizations in the capitalist system combines supply and demand. It's not just about the supply side, about we're producing great products. It's about they're meeting some kind of demand, and the performance measures that markets focus on have something to do with combining both. What I didn't quite get from your exposition is to which extent and how does demand penetrate this logic, which sounds to me supply-based. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So first of all, I am worried about the cost efficiencies, the financial kind of performance of the firm too. And secondly, I'm very important to my argument is that these are organizations that are precisely socialistic insofar as they're paying attention to what the true nature of the demand is. In the capitalist organization, the organization typically is looking primarily to maximize its profitability, and the utility of the product or service they offer is a vehicle to that end. These are organizations, I think, under pressure to reverse that equation and find a way to deliver something of value to society, but remain financially viable. So reversing the order of importance of those factors.
We have a question right here.
Hi, I'm a student here at Saïd Business School. I'm reading MBA. I was at your first lecture, and it was great for me being in the third one too, especially because I have long been associated with the software development industry. My prior experience of 12 years is mostly in the software development industry, and it's more of a comment I have than a question. You write CMMI was a great development towards collaboration and efficiency in the software industry. It has been superseded since mostly by agile processes, which is even more collaborative. And in fact,
explain to people the new process. What
it is agile technology.
Agile, yes, that's right.
So agile processes.
Sure.
And that is even more collaborative. and in fact, it removes some of the inefficiencies of CMM, like the additional the waste documentation and so on, and it definitely shows the move of the software development industry to be more socialistic. So, and from these terms, it helped me kind of relate back to what's happening in the software development industry, especially.
Thank you.
So
maybe over drinks afterwards, I can pick your brains a bit more about Agile. I've been very interested in Agile for a long time.
Maybe one more question. I don't have, maybe just here in the front. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Sam. I'm a PhD student here at Oxford. I'm very excited about this idea that these ways of transforming work will be could be transferred over to a broader social transformation. But I think that there's a jump that I can't quite answer, which is, how would you dismiss the proposal that these ideas of involving workers more in their organizations are not just a different way of increasing the amount of control that firms have over their workers? Are workers more likely to reorganize society if they feel more at home in their very, cozy cubicles working for a software company, a car manufacturer, or a healthcare firm?
Right. So let me paraphrase and see whether I got your question right, because I think I get where you're going. You could imagine that a counter-argument to my thesis that these organizations are fostering the development of workers who would be more ideal subjects for some radical transformation of society. You might counter that by saying, if their work environments have become so congenial to doing things that they care about, why would they care about changing the broader society? My argument is that even in these high-performance firms, there are constant tensions. There are stock market pressures. There's other pressures in the organization that are at war with those new principles of organization and with their socialist underpinnings. And secondly, we've got the external competition, the low-road performance, that are constantly threatening. And indeed, in two of the three cases I presented, right, we've seen NUMI disappear entirely. We've seen CSC almost blow up the Program A group and suffer all kinds of other problems that get workers really angry. That the potentiality of this model is not something that they can see becoming the norm. That's my conjecture. It needs testing. I'm hoping to be able to do some survey work. I think there's a wonderful project to be done where we look at workers in different workplaces, some where there's more engagement in these principles, some where there's less, and we calibrate the extent of their civic engagement. And we see whether increases in the presence in the workplace of these high engagement kinds of work practices and the socialistic underpinnings of them in that organization incline workers in the direction I'm suggesting towards more civic engagement, or as you're fearing, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable conjecture, right, that it might make them very comfortable. My argument, my assumption is that there are many factors that disturb, that create tensions here. I'm presenting the one side of a tension-filled situation. I'm presenting the optimistic, the bright side of an evolutionary process that is a highly tension-filled process. Those tensions, I have no doubt in my mind that those tensions are plenty enough to provoke workers' conviction that some systematic transformation is necessary. But I could be wrong. So empirical testing could be a terrific tool, next step in this research. So thank you very much for asking.
Thank you for those questions. I didn't mention this at the beginning. Paul just finished as president of the Academy of Management, which is 18,000 members. And it's a major commitment for many years. He's also an editor at Organization Science. He has many commitments, so we were thrilled to get him here. And this was a fantastic set of lectures, provocative and interesting, and it sounds like we'll have a nuanced discussion about Genossenschaft and Gemeinschaft. And there's a drinks reception.
My favorite conversation.
That's right. And so there's a drinks reception right here, out here, but please join me in thanking Paul Adler again for these.